All right, welcome everyone. We are live here on Techstars Crowdcast. My name's Casey. I'll be helping to moderate and lead this event with you today. If you are tuning in, you can see us. Go ahead and shout out in the chat where you are tuning in from. Love to see where our viewers are watching us and watching this broadcast from. Today we are joined with our partners at Silicon Valley Bank and talking about a super important topic that you should know as running your startup and fundraising, and that we get a lot of questions about is balancing the art of valuation with the science of dilution and how that can impact your startup's journey. So today we have some awesome professionals with us to help answer your questions. And before we introduce our speakers, just a little bit of housekeeping. We have the chat over here, so you can interact with other attendees there. I will also be watching it if you have any questions or tech issues. And then below our faces in the screen, there is an Ask a Question box. And we ask that you put any questions you have for our speakers in there, anything about valuation and dilution, and we will take questions after the slide. So make sure you put those in there at any time, and we'll help answer your questions near the end of the event. And also, there is a polls section next to Ask a Question. So we want this event to be interactive. So as we go through the slides, we will have some polls just to learn more about the audience and the other founders here in the room. So make sure you pay attention to the polls area too as we go through those. And so to kick everything off, I'm going to pass it to our speakers for introductions. And I'm going to start with Jason.
Hello, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us. My name is Jason Seitz. I am the Chief Investment Officer at Techstars, and I've been with Techstars for about a decade. I am a former entrepreneur. Built an early cloud computing company and have been an angel investor in VC in many dozens, actually hundreds of companies. Techstars' total portfolio, I think over 2,500 companies today.
Awesome. And Josh?
Well, hi, folks. Thanks for having me here. So I'm Josh Seidenfeld with Cooley. I work with startup companies, so everything from day one forming a business all the way through a liquidity event, whether that's a sale or an offering, and all the financing activity that happens in between. I've been doing this at Cooley now for a little over a dozen years. And before Cooley, I also once upon a time started my own company and sold that, and then actually worked at a number of different startup companies, including a few that were relatively high growth. So I had a chance to sit on the other side of the coin before coming over to the firm here, and looking forward to speak with everybody today.
Awesome. And Lewis?
Hi, everyone. Lewis Hauer from Silicon Valley Bank, calling in from San Francisco, foggy San Francisco, California. So if you're somewhere where it's summer, I saw somebody in Lisbon. I'm jealous of a true summer. But yeah, similar story. I've been in this space. I'm a bioengineer, did startup biotech, then built some venture funds all over the world, ran venture for a family office. I've been helping to lead our early stage practice here at Silicon Valley Bank for about 3.5 years. Long time partners with our friends, both at Techstars as well as Cooley. And so excited to be here today with everyone. So with that, Casey, are we diving right in?
Let's do it. Yeah. And before we get to the slides, I just want to make another welcome. We're live streaming over to our LinkedIn page, the Techstars LinkedIn live page. So welcome to the viewers over there. And if you're watching from LinkedIn, you can go ahead and submit questions in the comments, and I'll be watching both of those at the same time, and we'll transfer your questions over here for our speakers. So Lewis, take it away.
Awesome. Thanks, Casey. And Josh and Jason, as we called out, I think this is meant to be dialogue. Let's be compelling. Let's be provocative. I'm sure we've all seen deals in our time, as well as even more recently, that sometimes leave you scratching your head or saying, what exactly, how did that come together? So I know we had a poll going. Part of this is to help us get an understanding of kind of who's in the audience. Curious of what stage some of the founders are at. I actually saw a chat already of somebody saying we dealt with this back in our IPO in 1982. So sounds like maybe we've got some serial entrepreneurs in the mix, but also jump into polls. Let us know where you're at. Looks like lots of pre-seed seeds. So we know how to kind of cater and tee up some of our conversation today. But maybe as a starting place, Jason and Josh, part of the reason we've framed this conversation is everybody always wants to know, some of these key questions. How much money should I raise? How much is too much? What should my valuation be, right? Every founder, even if you're a repeat founder, I have these conversations on a regular basis of what's going on in the market? What should I know? How should I protect myself? What does this look like? So before we dive into some of the kind of tips and tricks, I'd love just to get your guys' finger on the pulse of where we're at now, kind of this moment in time being one that presumably we've never experienced before, both because of COVID, but also because of the market dynamics that we're seeing. So maybe Jason, I'll tee it up to you first from the perspective of sitting in the Techstars seat, deploying capital. Kind of how are you thinking about it? What are you looking at now from a valuation mindset? And then Josh, sitting from the lawyer's seat, maybe a little bit more of the founder's seat and thinking through that, I'd love to get your take as well, just to tee us up. So sure. Jason, what are you seeing these days?
Yeah, I mean, there's no question that in the current market environment, the valuations in terms are entrepreneur and startup favorable versus investor favorable. I mean, that's pretty obvious. But I think something that I'd say is accurate today, that's always been accurate, is there's really sort of two camps that you're in when you're out raising money. It's either easier than you expect or harder than you expect. Like that's generally how it goes. And so hearing that it's startup favorable terms and there's all this money sloshing around, that's not going to be a comfort to you if you're struggling to raise around. And there are certainly lots of entrepreneurs that are going through that struggle, even in the current market. And so I think, I'd say valuations on the net are clearly up. I mean, they've moved significantly even in the last year. But that dynamic of, are you sort of in the haves or the have-nots group, like that hasn't really changed. And depending on what numbers you look at, in some cases, I think potentially that dynamic has gotten more exaggerated, which is a challenge, right? And so to be careful to extrapolate to your situation. And I think you'll hear in some of my other reactions to things that we're going to talk about. Just I have a perspective on this that's, it's less about justifying sort of the value of your startup, and it's more about what is the supply and demand for the shares of your startup. And because that's ultimately the thing that's going to drive price, and the reason why there's a bit of a market imbalance today is that the demand for things that look like they're going to work or that feel exciting, like they're going to work, is very high. And so when you think about how you want to approach fundraising, the real name of the game is how do you become that versus how do you figure out what the right price is. And so it's more of a binary, are you going to be in demand or not, is sort of how I think about it.
Yeah. Go ahead, Josh.
No, I mean, those are all great points, Jason, and I agree with you there. And what I would say is, I mean, just to echo the point, I've not seen a market like this before. I mean, it is quite busy in terms of just the volume of deals. But the other thing that's particularly interesting to me is who the players are. So even if you go back a couple of years ago, there are investors that focus, of course, on first capital in, or there are true seed investors, and obviously there are some that focus on later stage investments as well. And one of the things that I have noticed is that not only are we seeing a lot of new players start to invest in companies downstream, but a lot of late stage investors are actually setting up the infrastructure to start investing in early stage companies as well. But not all capital is the same. So just because a fund is set up and someone's used to playing at later stages doesn't mean that they're providing terms that you'd see or consistent with early stage venture. And so even though people are raising more money, I think on average, and I think valuations have increased to the point that Jason was making. To me, there are just certain things that you always want to make sure that you're really thinking about, and it all really goes down to kind of to me, it's the strategic or kind of human aspect of who you're doing business with. So is this really the right partner for your company? And what's the track record there? And how are the terms that you were thinking about? Even if you are starting to weigh, dilution versus, actual legal terms in the documents, how much flexibility do you have? And what does this relationship look like for you going forward? Those are all things that it's hard to put an actual price tag on, but if things aren't always up and to the right, and not every bet that you make is perfect, having that flexibility is something that, at least from my perspective, I put a premium on.
Yeah, thanks. Both good kind of call outs of, and we weren't trying to be too cheeky with the title of this, but there is both the science from a pure mathematics perspective, but there's also an art, right? And Josh, you touch on some of the elements of what else goes into it, where are you at down the road, how do you plan for the future while still executing today? And Jason, your point of kind of supply and demand of the shares, I think is a really interesting one. We hear a lot, and I think we'll touch on it a little bit later, of how much is your valuation driven by pure FOMO and or market hype versus where you're actually at. So with that, I wanted to dive a little bit deeper, and Casey, I think we can be on the next slide just as a tee up. But when we'll talk a little bit now about kind of valuation and thinking about valuation, and then in the kind of second phase, we talk a little bit more about some of the tips around dilution and how, while they are absolutely linked, just kind of for now, let's slide into our founder shoes for a little bit, but also kind of thinking this question. And I think I don't want to jump the gun, Casey, on all the questions, but I saw a question in the Q&A already of like, how do I think about value? Right. So maybe lay out a few of the key. We hear all the time, like you need to be at least 1, maybe 2 million in ARR before you raise a Series A. We've got some of these blanket things that are out there in the market, but I'm curious to hear y'all's perspective about how, as a founder, do you really need to be thinking about the valuation of your company to both make it realistic, but also to set that expectation for where you think you can go in the future?
Sure. Yeah, I'll jump in, and as I kind of teased out a little bit, I have maybe a different way of thinking about this. Now, first off, I will maybe put a plug in for great service providers like SVB and Cooley. I mean, when you're raising money, like a really, really good way to just understand a pulse of like, what does the market look like now and what you're seeing, like those are the people who see transactions. Like they know the last deal that closed last week and last month and similar stage startups and things like that. But the thing that all three of us know, having seen the market, is there really is no formula. There's always the exception that breaks the rule, which is why I made the point that supply demand for being in the deal is really the thing. And so my best advice to a founder who says, how do I make sure I'm getting fair price here for my company, is, do you have competition for the deal or not? If you have competition for a deal, pretty good chance that you're going to get what the market looks like is fair price. But if you don't, like you're not going to move a VC's price based on your justification of what's happening with the business, because at this stage, at pre-seed, at seed, and even at Series A, financially speaking, the right way to think about a startup is it's a long dated out of the money option. And the option value is a totally different way to think about what this looks like, because from the VC's portfolio construction standpoint, a very small number of companies are going to drive all of the return, and the rest are going to be zeros. And it doesn't really matter exactly what price they pay for the zeros. What matters is sort of what the outcome looks like on the things that are going to work. So I would turn the thing on its head a little bit, because I've seen too many entrepreneurs get locked in on 100K in MRR equals my ability to go raise this, or 200K, or whatever sort of the modern version of that is in this moment, which is probably it's that $1 to $2 million range. You feel like, hey, go raise a Series A. But I just have seen too many startups get to that point and then still find that they're unable to do that, unable to raise a round. And so the question is, why are they not able to raise a round? And in my view, it's as simple as you haven't created a scenario where the investors feel the inevitability of a successful outcome. Like if it takes you 4 years to get to $1 million in ARR, like like that's not going to sound as good or look as good as a company that does it in 1 year. So there's this element of time. There's this element of sort of what, like the inevitability of success is the way that I would think about it. And that's the explanation for why some companies with no revenue can go raise $5 million or $10 million. And you think, why can they do that? And how is that justified? And it really comes down to just thinking about it a different way. You're not going to convince an early stage, seed stage investor of the value of a business by looking at a financial model. It just doesn't, it's not going to work like that.
So I'll jump in here. Those are great points, and it's similar, but a different way that I phrase maybe the same type of thing. So from my perspective, when you're talking about a seed round or even a Series A, what I typically tell people is those are market-based financings. And it's less about performance, which is where you see real separation when you start getting into financings post Series A, so like a Series B financing. And you don't have to take my word for it. One of our resources that we've put out there for folks to look at, which I'll put the plug for here, but it's free for everybody. We have a website called Cooley Go. We're really proud of it. So it's just CooleyGO.com. There's a whole bunch of stuff there, but in particular, there's data that we put out that includes financing data that's relatively recent. That's all de-identified, but it's by region or type of financing. And what you'll notice when you go take a look is that when you look at seed financings, you will notice that it's a very tight cluster, and almost the same thing with Series A in terms of the valuation and the amount of capital that's raised. I mean, there's always going to be outliers. That's how statistics work. But when you see, Series B or later, you will notice that there's a much broader, circumference at the end of the day if you're trying to graph out, where people are raising. And that's because I do view that as more of a performance-based type financing. And so to me, when you're thinking about it, I always think a little bit differently here, where it in part depends on the valuation. To me is almost like a peg for really how much of the company the investors are really going to be able to purchase. And so it's just a math formula. And if you're talking to some investors, you might find that they'll have a target for a seed round of a 10% ownership objective. And so really you should be thinking a lot about how much money am I needing to raise so I can get my business to the next stage of financing or the next stage of growth. What's the next milestone that I actually expect to achieve? And making sure that you raise enough capital so that you can get there. Because if you're really, really focused on only the dilution that you're thinking about for the first financing, but you don't raise enough capital to get yourself to the Series A, if you're raising a seed as an example, then that interim bridge that you might need to do, that's going to be a lot more expensive. And overall, you probably end up taking a lot more dilution that way than thinking about it. In fact, what's the right milestone? How much capital do I need to get there? And how much cushion do I need to put into, my model to ensure that's accurate? Because ultimately, I do think you're going to end up, for most folks, in that same cluster in terms of the actual economic terms. But the lever you can adjust is you can adjust the capital in, of course, and then ultimately, hopefully kind of grow the business to a satisfactory level where you can really start to shave off dilution points downstream as well.
Love it. And thanks, Josh. And as is typically the case, it's made a brilliant segue into the kind of some of the next themes. So Casey, maybe throw up the next poll, if you don't mind, as you talk about, because there is this element of, and really to synthesize quickly before we jump into this, of, valuation, it's not the set formulaic. There's an understanding of what's happening in the market. There's an understanding of kind of a little bit of where you're at, but it's more so where are you going and how can you grow into that? And so understanding the dynamics of what does it mean to where are you going and how do you grow into that? Certainly then the flip side, we start to talk about dilution. We start to get an understanding, and Casey, you can go to the next slide. This is up in polls, but that Josh, you hit on some really, I think, important points that we'll dive into some of these kind of tips and tricks of understanding the impacts of dilution, of that it's easy as a founder. I was talking with a founder just the other day who said, wow, the valuations that I'm getting presented are insane. And it caused a little bit of fear and panic in this founder's eyes and voice. I could tell it. They were like, this is insane, because if I look at my revenue, if I look at where I'm at and then where I think I need to be in X amount of time, there's this element of like, I'm not so sure that I can grow fast enough. And so where does that leave the company as they look forward? And so kind of diving into some of these tips of when we look at dilution and understanding the impact. The first tip, I think, Casey, is follow the rules of the game. It's a little bit of a vague title. I don't really know that I missed this one in our our screening process, because I think what you're hearing from this group is there's a little bit of like, sure, there are rules, but in some ways there aren't really actually rules. It's what is the investor to founder fit? What is the market that you're building in? How does that operate? And I think more of the way that I think about this concept, and it segues us into the next tip, is how much money should you raise? And I want to pause here for a little bit for a conversation around. It looked like in the poll, we've got a lot of pre-seed, some seed stage founders. When we talk about kind of, you always hear this, like, don't raise more than you need or raise the right amount. And pre-COVID, certainly the dialogue was, have anywhere from 8 to 12 months of runway. Then COVID hits, and certain business models, it was, well, you need 24 to 36. Kind of take a little bit of time to unpack, Josh, maybe I'll come back to you first. Like, when you say don't raise more than you need, or when we have this conversation of raise what you need now to hit that next milestone, as you guys both talked about, how do you think about that in relation to building of a model and understanding what's going on in your business?
Yeah, this is a tough one for people all the time, but it's a great question. And so typically the way that I try to talk through this with folks is, again, really kind of honing in on what you actually need to achieve from a business perspective in order to make sure that your company is going to be viable for what should be the next round of financing. And so usually what I like to say is go to some friendly investors, go stress that and see, are the milestones that you have at the end of the day, are those the right ones? Because if they're not, you're going to hear that right away, and that obviously might change the dynamic of how much capital that you need to raise. And then I treat this the way that you would any other equation that you're thinking about. So, you have a high, medium, low scenario. You have to, weight those and see how much capital that you'd actually bring in. And then once you can get to a place where you say, fine, I need, whatever it is, $7 million in order to make sure that, I'm going to be a Series B company, as an example, at the end of the day. And you have the milestones pegged because you've stressed that with the right investors. Then you can start really thinking about, okay, what's the right way for me to think about actually bringing those dollars in, so that you're balancing kind of the dilutive effect for the business, because you have multiple ways that you can raise capital at the end of the day, right? So you can always just go pure equity investment, and there are some partners that will look and say, look, we get it, we think that these milestones are challenging, so we're going to tell you the ownership that we want for the deal is 25%. And one of those things that you're going to want to have a bearing on, so you understand really what that cost of capital is what are, again, kind of these rules of the road or market terms when you're thinking about that. And so I was kind of hinting before, there are some seed investors that may have a target of 10%. A lot of Series A investors, if you're looking at a traditional Series A investor, they usually have target ownership goals of 20%. And so the lever of valuation kind of in these more market-based terms versus capital in, there's your math equation. Like, how much capital am I going to get for 20% of the business? But one of the things to think about, and this is, obviously relevant here, with our team on the call, is, do you supplement that with debt as well? And that's one of the things I talk to with a lot of companies, is making sure you understand what all the sources of capital are. So you're going through this process in a systematic way. You've stressed what the milestones are, what the capital that you need is, and you have an idea of what the rough cost might be. Now, what are the right sources for you to combine those together so that you can actually hit the runway objective? The only warning I'll share on all of this is, you're entrepreneurs. So intrinsically, you're going to have a view as to, your success. Otherwise, you wouldn't be starting, the impossible journey of building something from scratch. But you have to take that into consideration when you're thinking about capital, because I too often, maybe on the conservative lawyer side, see people that are too optimistic and not realistic about, pitfalls or things that they may hit. And so I'm always a fan of saying, you might need a little more than you think you do. And so just keep that in mind when you're kind of putting your model together.
Jason, before you dive in,
sure.
I was just going to ask your take on because you touched on it a little bit before, but kind of raising enough to get to those subsequent milestones, or kind of, if you're a super early stage company, and Josh, you kind of said like, oh, go talk to those investors. How do you sit with your companies, the companies in the Techstars portfolio, kind of in those early stages of what is that actual next milestone, and how do you find that out? Is that doing your investor network and conversations two raises down the road, or kind of how do you balance that? And then if you want to talk on kind of the how much do you need to know, to raise topic.
Great prompt, and actually was going to go my answer will kind of maybe touch back to tip one, which is what are the rules of engagement here.
Yeah.
There's a warning that I feel like is worth heeding. The way that I view fundraising is that ultimately it is a search process. It is not an act of persuasion. And I think a lot of founders feel like when they get an investor, the move is to grab on with both hands and don't let go of them until you convince them that they want to invest in your company. And that is just not how it works. I think the right way to think about it is, for all intents and purposes, there are effectively infinity investors out there, because you will run out of time and will to go on before you'll run out of a few other investors to talk to. And so the mindset to have is to view that there is an investor out there who has resonance with what you're doing already, and that your goal is to try and find them. That you're not trying to convince someone that this is a big market. You're trying to find someone who already instinctively is going to believe that when they hear about it. So and that is super important. The reason why I bring this up is as you're trying to gut check and test with investors what are the next goalposts, you have to be very discerning on, are you getting real data points, or are you getting someone who's just telling you something to kind of get you out of their office or off the phone? And because it's really it's the easiest delay tactic in the world for an investor is to just tell you a milestone that's further out than where you are. And then you go get to that milestone, come back to that same person, and they just move the goalposts. And so moving the goalpost feeling is like that will happen if you're talking to someone who's not actually interested in the business and doesn't sort of have this intrinsic belief in the thing that you're doing. So I think the first key skill to hone as an entrepreneur is understanding how to tell the difference between those two things, because there are definitely investors focused on different stage. There is a version of, hey, you're too early for us, but too early for us could also be code for, we're just not interested in this. And you have to be able to try to figure out the difference. I think one safe place to try and do that is in the construct of mentorship. So maybe a bit of a Techstars plug, but accelerators and places like Techstars where you can meet with VCs on some sort of neutral footing, where the rules of engagement are they're going to tell you the real feedback, because they're not afraid that you're going to flip over the table and yell at them and get upset and try to debate them. They'll tell you what they're actually thinking and what other VCs are actually going to think when they hear the story. Like, that is incredibly valuable. And it's important to find that and recognize that when you find that, that's different than finding someone who's really an investor lead for you. That is finding someone who's willing to give you the gift of real, legitimate, direct feedback. And that's kind of hard to find in this industry, because people don't want to piss each other off, and you don't want to make an entrepreneur upset, and don't want to tell them that the thing they're doing just isn't that interesting. And so I'd say that is the first step, is find someone who you can get real feedback from, understand how to tell the difference between that and someone who's just trying to get you out of their office. So in terms of how much to raise, like what's the right number, how to think about it, I'd say really important is to begin with the end in mind, to really sit down and think about what it is you're trying to get to. And it could be different for different startups and different entrepreneurs. It could be, how do I think about what the next fundable moment is for this company? That's totally valid. There are definitely entrepreneurs who think, hey, I want to raise money to get to the point where I control my own destiny and my business is break even, and then I can go raise money again and invest in the next wave of growth. And you go through this cycle of sort of using that money to expand and get back to a safe spot where, via debt or working capital or whatever else, you don't actually need the external investors, but you can use them for leverage. That's a great spot to be, but don't kid yourself on it. And I think is the important thing. And so I think one of the things that my reaction to just the title and the slide, "Don't raise more than you need," is really, yes, I agree with it to some extent, but the question is, what does more than you need mean? And I sort of heard, Josh sort of hit on this a little bit. And so I'll echo this. For seed stage companies, I don't think I have ever met a founder who says, boy, I wish I would not have taken that extra money that was offered to me. Like that basically never happens. Most of the mistakes people make is that they are trying to optimize for dilution and they don't raise enough. And there was more money they could have taken and it just takes an extra 6 months to get where they think they needed to get. And if you can't fund that extra 6 months, you die. And so one thing I'll tell Techstars founders is the only common attribute amongst all successful companies, the only thing they have in common is that they never died anywhere along the way. And so staying alive is incredibly valuable. And when you think about the value of your startup as a long dated out of the money option, the two key drivers of option value are volatility and time. And so you can control time with runway, and volatility is really about optimizing the upside scenarios because the downside volatility of all startups is the same. It's zero. Right. And so when you're in a mode where how do I make this thing worth more? How do I give it the longest life? And how do I increase the odds of it being a successful outcome? And so hypothetical scenario, company A versus company B, they're identical in every way, 100% identical. But company B has $2 million in the bank account. Company A has $1 million in the bank account. Which one of those two companies is more likely to succeed? It's the one with $2 million. And so the thing to think about is this is not a static situation. Raising more money actually increases your odds of having a successful outcome, and you have to balance that. Doesn't mean go crazy with dilution, but thinking about, sort of, are we raising too much money? That's not really an issue in my view until you're a growth stage company and you're looking at $100 to $200 million plus of preference overhang and can the business grow out of it, whatever. Or in that transition of early seed stage to now we're going to be valued on what our financials look like and understanding how to cross that gap from a seed stage Series A company to get a Series B, Series C stage company. And so I know there's a lot of elements there, but maybe some re-bullet point it. Don't try to persuade. It's a search process. Make sure you can find people that are giving you real feedback, direct feedback. When you're raising money, understand where you're trying to get with that. Begin with the end in mind, and don't over-optimize on dilution. Think about optimizing for increasing the odds of success for the startup, because that is actually financially the right way to think about it.
Love it. Thanks. And you gave a call out for the Techstars network from an investor perspective, but I also think it's super important to emphasize the founder network and ecosystem of those that have kind of gone before you, similar founders who might be in the same space but a little further along, to have that same sounding board as well, and in some cases even more realistic and honest feedback to you as a fellow founder in the listen, this needs to change, or this is where you need to focus time, energy, and effort. So great call out and a good transition into, okay, we've talked a little bit about the how much, what does that look like? And Casey, I know we have another poll on this, and I think I have a guess of where some of the outcomes might be, but I want to kind of dive us into, we've touched on kind of two sides of, as we look at notes, as convertible notes, both, and Josh, you called it out as a bridge in an unfortunate scenario where you haven't quite hit those milestones, or you're not at a place where you have that extra $1 million in the bank to get you to the next key level. But also on the other end of the spectrum, we had a lot of pre-seed. We had a lot of companies who still owned 100% of their founders who owned 100% of their company. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about kind of notes and caps, and this is an area that getting an understanding. Again, we've got some tips. Don't allow them for too long, but they can be super valuable and powerful in the early stages. And then the next kind of tip is, how do you think about caps, and where are the caps as some of these benchmarks and milestones? So I want to dive into the concept of early stage, when you're not quite ready to pin that valuation, but you're going to use some sort of a safe or convertible, as well as what are then caps come to mind when you start to do this calculus, right? This is when, for some, it gets a little cloudy. And Jason, I know, and even on Cooley Go, I'm guessing there's loads of tools that are out there that you can map and model all these various scenarios. But maybe step back from the calculus of it and talk a little bit about how do you guys think about it when you're sitting with founders thinking through in these first few raises where you're using notes?
Yeah, this is a real common pitfall. I think there is lots of legitimate value in using notes and safes and things like this to raise money because it is lighter paperwork. Although the templated nature of seed stage financing is going up, and so I'm not sure if there's as much benefit as there used to be in having lightweight docs or cheaper rounds. But I will tell you, raising that a founder who raises a note round and then raises a price round after that almost universally is surprised by how much dilution they get by those two events combined, especially when you factor in option pool expansion and things of that nature. And it's just because you're staring at a cap table that has this unconverted overhang that you don't really see the effect of. And it's tough to, you go raise a round that feels like a reasonably priced round, or note round, reasonable cap, and then you raise a reasonably priced round that it converts into, and you're giving up 50% of the company or 60% of the company, and you're wondering, like, how did this happen? And it is the same outcome that would have happened if you raised in two individual rounds. You just didn't see it because the first one was unconverted. And then there are certainly horror stories, and I've seen Techstars companies that have just so many notes stacked that final conversion event is a 90+% dilution event, which is a shock and a horrible outcome, right?
Yeah.
You really do need to go understand a model, get a spreadsheet out, understand what a conversion is going to look like, and you need to feel like that equity has actually been sold, even though the note is unconverted, which is hard to do, and be extremely cautious of stacking these notes on top of each other because the way that they work in conversion, it really amplifies the dilution you're going to experience.
Yeah, I can jump in on that because this is a conversation I have all the time, and it's a really tough one. And so I'll go back to a point that you said, Jason, in the last question we had, which is having good mentors or having good service providers. This is so important, in particular for this issue, because you should never go into a transaction not understanding what the ultimate effect of it is and what the downstream effect is in the next financing. And this is the kind of thing that anyone that's in this space that does this type of work can give you insight and can give you a model that you should be able to work with, because you really should understand how those variables play on one another. So if you start to understand that, look, when you go and raise your priced round, that priced investor is going to say the convertible that you're raising on is going to be in the pre-money, and that's going to happen, not 9 of 10. I mean, it's going to be, 19 of 20, right? I mean, almost every deal that you see, the convertible is going to be in the pre-money. And it makes sense, of course, because if you're a priced investor and you're saying, look, I'm, putting a, 1 million on 10 at the end of the day, they want to own their 10% of the company. Like, it's that simple. And so they're expecting that everything else out there is already on the cap table. And so that may be something that's surprising to people at the end of the day. So that means that if a founder, you're 100%, founder owned company, that means that you're taking all the dilution from the convertibles. And so, which would have been the same thing had you done a priced round, of course, but then it also goes into the meat of, well, what does that convertible say and how does the terminology work? And so a lot of times, when folks use safes, even if you're just, grabbing, one off the internet at the end of the day, there are different forms of them. And now a lot of investors have started modifying and making their own forms. And so you have to understand, it's one thing to understand, what the cap is, and that means, what the value ultimately is of the business. But even sometimes when I hear folks say, hey, I'm looking at a post-money cap, does that mean it's the, post-valuation? That's not what it means. It's just the pre-money valuation. That's the valuation that investor essentially ultimately will, divide a certain number of securities by, or a formula to get their price per share. And so, just because there are certain types of terms or terminology doesn't intrinsically mean what you think it means. You have to understand kind of some of the inner workings of it. And this is the kind of thing that it's reasonably straightforward to get a good answer on, but you have to make sure you get that advice. And And you also have to understand kind of how the interplay works. So one of the things I point out to people nowadays, that's different advice than I would have given, 5 or 6 years ago, is when you start a company, if you're thinking the thing you might do is raise on a convertible, and in particular a SAFE, people used to start a company and say, yeah, look, I'll just put an equity incentive plan together and I'll, put some reasonably large number because I'm going to probably hire some folks, and I know my priced investors are going to make me, put my pool in the pre-money anyway. So maybe I'll just put a 15% pool together. No harm in that, right? Well, if you're using what some folks do nowadays and using kind of a post-money type of SAFE, all of that initial pool you put together that you weren't even using, that's all dilution that you're taking as founders. And so understanding that may change the way that you even think about your equity structure in terms of your growth going up into that initial SAFE financing, because that's usually not even a negotiable in that deal. And that can be material. That dilution in and of itself might be a couple percentage points at the end of the day. So to me, you want to understand how the security works, not just in the financing that you're working on, but you want to understand how that interplays in the next financing. And you really want to make sure that you see the visibility of the model and how the voting structure works. Because as Jason mentioned, it's not uncommon for someone to do 2 rounds of financing, and all of a sudden you go from owning 100% of the business to you're sub 50%, and you don't know how you got there. That shouldn't be the case. You should be going in eyes wide open, knowing what the relative dilution is going to be across 1 or 2 financings, so that you can structure things appropriately. And that also may affect how much you raise. What milestones that you're looking to achieve ultimately, so that you can ensure. One of the things that people always think about is maintaining control of a company that you started, and this kind of goes to the heart of that.
Love it, and yet again teeing up some dialogue for our next segment. But before we dive, maybe we should dive there. I want to make sure we've got time, Casey. We've got, it looks like a good handful of questions. So. To keep us moving along, Josh, you touched on it, is this concept of, as you look at the equity pool for your employees, and I know we have another poll question. I've given some of the answers previously, saying most people own 100% of their company already. Something to pay attention to. But as you look at this and the impact of both current either co-founders or talent that you need to bring on down the road, kind of what guiding principles as you guys think about option pools, and you think about that in relation to, Josh, you created a scenario, you painted a little bit of an image of this could come back to bite you, but there's a bit of a chicken and egg of, well, if I can't have something to attract the talent. These stories are real. I had a conversation last week with a founder who has a co-founder that was supposed to be out selling, wasn't really cutting it in that capacity, and his co-founder had to have the very real, like, listen, man, I need to take your shares back because I have to give those to somebody else who can come in and do the job, right? Like, those are not fun conversations to have, but how do you guys think about option pools and recruiting talent in relation to the overarching concept of valuation? We could spend a whole nother, hour long plus on this overall talent acquisition concept, but as relates to this, talk about how you guys think about and how you advise some of your early stage companies around option pools and longer term impacts therein.
Yeah, this is not a market term, but I always, whenever I have the ability to, like to try and push for doing option pool expansion post round versus pre-round. Philosophically, this is fully aligned, and I think there's a strong case to make to a VC that, hey, we haven't hired these employees yet, that we're going to compensate with these options. Like, this is for, like, we're going to do this together and after you invest, and therefore you should be experiencing the dilution of this as well as us. You certainly can try to recruit your existing cap table investors to help make that case with you, because ironically, whatever VC is leading that round, that wants pre-round pool expansion is going to be on the other side of the table on the next financing as well. And so it's, I don't know how often you'll win that, but I like the alignment. To me, I think it comes down to how complete the team is. Like, that's the real intangible. Like, and by team, I mean the core leadership team, because that's where the heaviest sort of option grants are going to be, obviously. So, if you've got a founding team that's sort of got one of every type of animal, and you feel like you've got all your bases covered, and don't need to bring in a lot of additional talent, you can go light. And what is light? I think light is like sub 10% on an early stage financing. I feel like 10 to 20% is sort of, that's always been sort of the range that feels like what an investor thinks they can ask for. Now that number's gone down quite a bit. It used to be closer to 20, and now it's probably a lot closer to 10, and because of the leverage. But I'd make sure that you understand if you're actually negotiating economics indirectly versus talking about how much equity do we need to use to incentivize to build the team we need to succeed. And if you're doing pre-round expansion, it's an economic term. If you're doing a post-round expansion, it's more about how do we together decide how we use the equity of this business to fuel its growth. That's a much more aligned conversation. And I think sort of answers around C today feel like market to me, but service providers are going to give you way better insights. And Josh, I don't know, what's market today on a seed or Series A option pool target?
Sure. No, I think you hit the nail on the head on that. So I'll talk about it from two different data points. So when you're forming a company and you're pre-raise, my advice now is, there's no reason to establish a bigger pool than what you're actually going to use. And it's not like it's a static number. It can change as much over time as you need it to. What I would definitely recommend doing is if you are granting equity to someone, make sure you do it under a pool though. That is very, very important to remember. I don't care if you want to call someone a founder. I don't care what title that you actually want to call them at the end of the day. Just make sure that you're giving them equity under your pool. And the reason I say this is because too many times people will bring someone in, and as you just heard about the example of someone not cutting muster on the sales side, of course, what can ultimately happen is if that person is part of the company and they're still vesting and they don't have shares in a pool, and then you do a priced round, and you happen to be, in that normal market category where that pool is in the pre-money, or those shares are all in the pre-money, even if they're not in the pool, and that person leaves before they're fully vested and post-financing, well, those shares, if they're not in the pool, they just disappear off the cap table. Everyone's ownership, including your investors, will increase. So it's effectively as like you raised on a different valuation, like your investors got a better deal. And I can tell you the number of times where a founder goes back to the investor and says, hey, look, X co-founder or this early engineer, left. And so we just want to put those shares in the pool instead. It's not a given that they're going to agree that's what will happen. They may say some of it can go back and might agree with you on that, but you might end up taking more dilution than you originally thought. So I definitely recommend using a pool as step one. But in the very early days, I try now to only use what you need type of thing, because you don't want to take the extra dilution if you are going to do a convertible round to begin with. But when you get to an actual priced round and it's a negotiation, Jason's point spot on here. Essentially, the market nowadays is right around 10% kind of in these early financings. And one of the ways that you can actually try to help yourself even get that pool lower, and I've been doing that with a lot of companies, because I also agree with the sentiment that if you hire the right people, that should be accretive for everybody. And so that should be a value for the investors that are coming in. And so why should management pay for senior hires, as an example, if everyone knows that you need them and they're very expensive? Why wouldn't that be shared with everyone? Because those hopefully are accretive for the company and for your investor. And so one of the things I always talk about doing in a priced round is to put a model together the same way you would on how you're going to use the proceeds, and you're going to decide if that's the right milestone that we were talking about before. You should do that with an equity budget. So you should know, if I'm going to raise $4 million, how many people am I going to hire with that? What is that going to ultimately cost me in equity? And if you can build out a model, that is a very good tool to say, look, I don't need a 15% pool or a 10% pool, because in even the worst case scenario, I'm going to only go through 8 between now and the next financing. It's a really powerful way to decrease dilution in the deal and only get a pool for what you actually need going into the next round, assuming you can't get it in the post, as Jason mentioned. That's one of the tools I like to call out for folks to think about.
Yeah, if it's in the post, you're not even having that debate, which is the nice thing.
Well, I think the point there, and Jason, you threw some good resources, and I know I want to be mindful of time because there's questions rolling in. But Casey, I'm going to jump us. So I'm going to make a plug for lots of great resources: Cooley Go, Techstars, Venture Deals. We've got a lot of stuff at SVB. and reach out to us, and we're here to help. So I'm going to jump us, Casey. I want to go to the Q&A portion, so we make sure we can get through those. But a quick while Casey, you're getting to that, Jason, how you talk about kind of the pre or post. How do you recommend, and quickly, if you can quickly answer this, how do you recommend a founder enter that conversation, right? Like, is it just like you get your lawyer to be your dirt man to say, listen, this is how it goes? Do you come in and say, like, how? I think there's a lot of founders who like, first of all, I didn't even know you could do that. Second of all, how do you have that conversation as a starting place? And then Casey, you can kind of rattle off some of the questions to us. Does that work?
Yeah, in general, I'd say it is never a good idea to use your lawyer as the front of your negotiation. And this is nothing against lawyers. I love lawyers, and that's not a joke. But at the end of the day, this is a partnership with your investors, and so you need to be able to be on the same page and have real talk conversations with them. And this is just a real talk conversation, right? I think the way I would approach it is, let's separate the concept of planning for our business. So I'm talking to you like you're the investor.
Together.
Let's separate the concept of planning for the future of our business and how we're going to spend our equity to grow the team from the economics of this deal. Those are two different things, because we can reach the same net economic outcome of your investment by doing a post-round expansion. You just move the numbers around. And so let's just get on the same side of the table and not have an indirect economic debate about price that is somehow commingled with what do we need from an option pool standpoint. And so I think once you do that, then in essence, the question is, would you accept a lower pre-money valuation because someone's willing to do post-round option pool expansion? I think yes. Why not? Okay. And then now you're aligned. And now you're right? So.
Yeah, it's a good call, and a true kind of the alignment of a partnership, not just you're buying something that you're going to then set on the shelf and see where it goes, right? Like that's such a critical aspect to it. All right, Casey.
All right, we have about 8 minutes, so we'll be rapid fire. But I think hopefully a lot of what you guys covered, will help answer these questions and stuff. And like Lewis said, if we don't get to your question, you can go ahead and reach out to them or go to the resources, the Techstars site, the Cooley site, SVB for startups, and plenty of resources there. So the first question at the top with 4 upvotes from Rebecca is, what do you look for in financial projections, since to some extent they are guesswork?
I'll give you a quick answer. It's not about the result, it's about the thought process. I think the value of a financial model is it helps you understand how the business works. The numbers don't have to be accurate, but the formulas do, right? Like how, and that's basically what its value is.
Couldn't agree more. How well do you understand your market? How well do you understand your customer and what that looks like for whatever it is you're building?
Cool. All right, next question. How much equity range should you expect to give away in a Series A round?
So I would just jump in here. I mean, I think a lot of Series A investors, they will target a 20% goal. If there's more risk in the business, that number might be larger. If it's a bigger capital raise, that number might be larger. And then, of course, you have the other aspect here, which is the equity incentive plan, like we were talking about. You have to, obviously plan for that. And then you have to think about dilution from convertibles if you have any of those outstanding.
And other investors in the round. So don't confuse what the lead investor's target is with the total dilution that that the round's going to be, right? So
cool. All right, next. Go ahead, Liz.
I was going to say, I just had a founder have to nicely ask that the fund that led their seed round not do their full pro rata, because another mega fund came in to lead the A, and the economics were starting to get a little bit tight. And then at that point, it's who takes the hit? Is it the founder or just the fund? So yeah, it's a good call to not forget about the other elements. We skipped over one of these pieces, but also Josh, you touched on it at the outset of knowing all of the terms, not just the dollar, not just the valuation and dilution, like what else is in there, pro rata, super pro rata, some of the terms that might end up catching you up down the road.
All right, next question. A couple votes on this one. Any climate change pricing models you can share?
I don't know if I've got an answer to that. I mean, I guess the thing I would my reaction is that particular investment segment or market, or however you want to think about it, is one that's got hype and momentum behind it. And so you're going to start to see leverage there. And so I think, it's good to know if you're going to know this obviously, but are you in an in-favor market? Are you in an out-of-favor market for the industry that you're trying to build a business in? And that's an in-favor market at the moment, which honestly is a good thing for the planet. But
Jason, to your point, it's way more about the opportunity, where it's going, less the like, hey, here's the specific number based upon your milestones. Because that is where I think in some of these climate change kind of either capital intensive businesses or very long-term option value, how do you think about that? But it's more of what is the interest and opportunity in the market, right? Josh, I know you work with some of the life science healthcare companies on occasion as well. And I saw one the other day that coming out of a research lab raised $75 million in their first raise, right? And that's not because that company's worth whatever the implied valuation is yet, but it's the potential future option value that is there that is driving that kind of a raise in valuation.
Yeah, 100%. And obviously, as I think was discussed earlier, it's also all about how much investor friendly can you create. So I think Jason made this point before. I mean, you want to see if you can get multiple folks to the table. That's not going to hurt you either.
Cool. Couple more questions I'd like to get answered, so we'll try to do quick with these ones. We have, what about differences of round sizes and valuations versus expectations between the US and Europe?
Anyone want to take that?
I'll just quickly say, I mean, it goes a little bit to some of the themes. It's a supply and demand of capital and founders. There are sectors over in Europe that are absolutely on fire. There are others that are struggling just because it's not the flavor of the week. Ultimately, we're seeing a lot more investor interest that is US going that way, that is going to help build kind of valuation and growth in that market, whereas historically we didn't see as much of that, but it's a supply and demand of capital to quality founders.
Yeah, the only thing I was going to chime in is, I'm in the Bay Area, so I'm in Silicon Valley, and I'm biased on this, but I think the further east you go, the terms are not quite as friendly at the end of the day, and I think that's true in terms of valuation and just the general actual legal terms or rights that your investors ultimately get. One of the good points out there, and you just mentioned this, is that U.S. investors a couple years ago were a lot more skittish on investing abroad. That is not the case at all anymore. I think there are a lot of U.S. investors that are focused in global companies, and that is only kind of helping drive, I think, terms that are consistent with what we're talking about, which is it's a founder-friendly environment.
Awesome. And let me see, last question. Let me finish that one. As a pre-seed startup founder, I've noticed many of the newer pre-seed funds have an increasingly high number of LPs. Is this something to be wary of in regards to funding to pursue?
You're not always going to know that. And I think maybe the thing that if there was a risk there, which I'm not sure that there is, I'm not some entrepreneurs really are going to care about what's the source of the money. And I think that's a totally legitimate question. But I think a thing to think about in terms of your largest sort of anchor investor in your business is how stable are they going to be as a firm and a partner. And the more stable their investor base, the more long-term of a partner that they can potentially be, versus a seed fund that raises one fund, but is sort of on shakier ground from an LP based standpoint and has a hard time raising that next fund. They still could support you, but if their venture firm goes poof, you just got them as an individual, right? So.
Awesome. Well, that is the not the end of the questions. We have more, but the end of our time. I want to thank Louis, Josh, and Jason for giving all of your wonderful insights. I think you can tell from the comments here in Crowdcast and also LinkedIn, super helpful for everyone learning about this. I know to me it's a whole different world, so I appreciate you guys laying out the mathematics and the insights and everything to it. Thank you, Silicon Valley Bank, for putting on this event and always supporting our Techstars startups. And thank you, Cooley, again for joining us. And if you have any questions, please reach out in the chat. We will email the recording link and also some other resources for you. The recording will be available right here at this link on Crowdcast after we finish. Also, it will be on the Techstars YouTube channel later, so I'll throw that in the chat. So thank you, speakers, and we'll see you guys next time.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.